Chihuahuan Desert spans over the south part of Arizona and New Mexico, sprawling down to the west of Texas and crossing over into the border of northern New Mexico. The desert can reach over 100 degrees during the summer and at the height of the day, but at night, a lot of people don't know that the desert can get really cold. I'm talking below freezing, usually often at 0 degrees. You do not want to be caught in the desert at night, much less alone, with the deadly animals who call the climate their home. Scorpions, coyotes, and rattlesnakes. Out in the middle of nowhere, where no one can hear you call for help. Can anyone even hear you if you scream? Because if you get caught in the desert alone, especially at night, that might be your only option. Praying that your voice carries. And someone at the edge of the desert just might hear you. But that's also a question. Can you scream on command? Some people can't. It's a real thing. Many people have really low voices, really low vibratos, that they are unable to scream due to their vocal cords. You might think that's a really cool thing, but that can also be the cause of some people's end. Now, what if you could solve your own murder years after your passing with the law that your family lobbied to get passed? One that would change the world for the better. When you always said you'd do something to change the world one day, and you did, even after your passing. Hey, I'm Serenity, and this is my channel, and today we're joined here by Capella, Nebula, Nova, and Capella is right behind me. She doesn't want to move. Welcome to another Hometown Horrors. Today we are going to be discussing a case that I have been working on for over a year. It is such a large case that I've kind of just been slowly writing it. Today we're going to be discussing the case of Katie Sepich and how she changed US law forever for the better. But before we begin, I do want to give an announcement. Starting this episode, every True Crime Thursday video that I upload on this channel will now become available on Spotify as a podcast. It is the podcast version of this series. I know every single video of mine is classified under some sort of category. So we have ludicrous atrocities, hometown horrors, and I have some sort of playlist that those all are on my channel. But I decided to name this podcast Hometown Horrors because it is what I've kind of been known for. And honestly, this channel wouldn't be where it is today without the series. So on Spotify, you can now find the audio only version of these weekly uploads going forward. Now there will be no sound effects for when pictures pop on screen or any sort of background music. It's simply just the audio version of me talking. That's it. I know some of you like to listen to these maybe on your drive to work. Now you can listen to the audio only version over on Spotify. Now before we begin, I do want to give a couple trigger warnings. This is such a large case. There are technically 3 different stories that intertwine into one that we're going to be discussing. So the trigger warnings include murder, arson, burning of bodies, assault, rape, kidnapping, house intruders, mentions of drugs. It's a big one. So if you think any of these topics you'd be unable to handle, please stop watching, put yourself first, and I'll see you at a later date with a different video. If I get any information wrong, please kindly let me know below. I did try my best to get the following information as accurate as possible. However, I used multiple different sources, and if one source only mentioned one thing, I went with the most commonly reported detail. This case is very large, like I keep saying, so no matter how many details I double, triple checked, sometimes things just get lost. So please give me grace and kindly let me know down below. Sources are all linked down below for you to check them out. Lastly, this video is informational research study that I am sharing for academic entertainment reasons only. I mean absolutely no harm to anyone mentioned, especially the victim and the victim's family. Please settle in, grab a drink, and let's get into it. On August 31st, 2003, in the outskirts of Las Cruces, New Mexico, just outside city limits, there was a couple practicing their target shooting when they stumbled upon a partially nude body just lying on the ground. They immediately called the police, and a sheriff investigator was dispatched, and he arrived shortly on scene, looking for any signs of life on this body that this couple had discovered. And then he began to interview the couple about what they had found. It appeared that the body had been left in the desert for several hours with only a shirt left on her body. If the couple wasn't there target shooting that day, it is really unknown if when this body would have been found. And in the desert, in the hot sun, bodies decompose a lot faster. So that would have been sped up, and we don't know how long it would have taken someone else to find the body, especially because where the body was left, it was between the desert where this couple was target shooting and the city's landfill, like the garbage trucks take the week's trash to. So someone had purposely left the body there to not be found. Robert Jones was the sheriff captain for the Donna Ana County Department, which is the county that Las Cruces resides in at the time of this case. And he was one of the first officers to arrive on scene. The unalive body was laid face down with her legs spread open, and Sheriff Jones believed that the body was left like this as a sign of dominance by her attacker. This was a position that made the attacker probably feel strong. The woman's killer had also tried to burn her corpse to rid of any traces of evidence by pouring some kind of liquor on her, mostly onto her shoulders and upper back. But that was unsuccessful, and it just left a complete mess. The attacker had lit the body on fire, but that was unsuccessful. So instead, it seems that they just left the body behind and badly burned, scraped up, but still in an identifiable condition. The victim appeared to be a female in her 20s with shoulder-length brown hair and bright blue eyes, but no ID could be found on her. Detectives also discovered a tire track left behind in the desert, and the police collected photo evidence of this tire track, and also they made like a plaster cast of it, so they had a physical imprint of this tire track because they believed it would be very important in this case. And that was probably the car tire tracks of the killer's vehicle. To the cops, it seemed like the victim had been killed at some other location and possibly sexually assaulted, and her deceased body was brought out to this area right next to the landfill just outside of the city to be disposed of. Back in the city around 3 p.m. on August 31st, 2003, a little over 4 hours after the body had been discovered in the outskirts of town, a woman called the Las Cruces Police Department, reporting her college roommate as missing. Her roommate claimed that she had last seen her missing roommate at a house party the night before with her boyfriend. Mark Myers was a detective at the time when this call came in, and to him, it was odd because the woman's home and distance to this party were so close that her not making it home was odd. It seems it was so close that why couldn't she make it home? The missing woman also didn't take any of her personal items or any of her belongings, including her car. Seemingly because her home was so close that if she needed anything, she could either walk out to her car to grab it or just walk home if she needed something else. Police then responded to the call, arriving at the house where they met a woman named Tracy Waters. At the home she shared with her roommate, police knew at this point that the body of a 20-something-year-old woman was found in the desert earlier that day, but they are now thinking that this missing woman that Tracy called in could be their unidentified victim. Once they arrived at Tracy's house, investigators immediately asked for a photo of the woman. Tracy grabbed a photo off of her bulletin board and handed it over to officers. The photo was of a 22-year-old woman with shoulder-length brown hair and beautiful, clear, bright blue eyes. Her name was Katie Sepich. Las Cruces is a college town. I've covered a couple cases based in Las Cruces before, and it has one of the best universities in the state located in the town, which is New Mexico State University. Katie was about to start grad school. She was going for her Master's of Business Administration, also known as an MBA. Things were changing in her life. One of those was Katie's boyfriend, Joe Bish. Their relationship wasn't really the healthiest of relationships, and that's even saying something because many college relationships aren't that healthy. And we'll be talking about that more later on. But for now, Joe was moving back to his hometown of Gallup, New Mexico, about 340 miles away from Las Cruces, to help run his family's small business. The pair had plans to do long distance, already scheduling weekends in which they could switch out and visit each other, but the distance was beginning to take a toll on the pair. It was a holiday weekend of August 31st, and the next day was actually September 1st, which is Labor Day here in the States. So Joe was in town to come and collect the remaining belongings of his that he had left at his home in New Mexico that he shared with a couple roommates. The couple had made plans to hang out that day before he would return back to Gallup. Katie was busy on the day of August 30th, which is that Saturday of the month. She worked the day at her job, which we'll discuss again later on. And afterwards, she kind of pulled Joe over to a jewelry store and he bought her a promise ring that she had been eyeing. The previous day on August 29th, she had taken Tracy, her roommate, to this jewelry store and they went to look at this ring that Katie wanted. This was the one Katie was eyeing that she wanted Joe to buy her. Now, Tracy wouldn't even categorize this as a promise ring. It was Katie's birthstone, which is a December birthstone, which she believed was like a ring sort of hinting at a future, but not really a promise ring to each other, like, I promise down the line we're gonna get married. It was more of like, we're probably gonna stay together for a long time and maybe we'll get married, but here's this pretty ring. That's kind of how Tracy saw this ring. It wasn't that Joe had bought the promise ring like out of his own want. It was that Katie wanted the ring and she wanted this commitment from him. So she pulled him and said, hey, this is what I want. They both were looking towards the future together, spending it together. But again, their relationship wasn't that healthy. On August 30th, after the sun had gone down, Katie, Joe, Tracy, and a couple of their friends had decided to go out to party. They went to a few bars around town, just near their house, just for a long evening of letting off some steam and party. The school year was about to start up again. They were going to be busy. They just wanted a night of letting steam off. Katie was going around showing off her new ring to her friends that Joe had gotten her, and he was by her side most of the night. That night they went out, and the group's usual activities kind of continued. They ended the night at one of their friends' homes to keep the party going on. You know, bars usually close at a certain time, so they decided to move the party to one of the friends' house. Now, Tracy was so tired that she actually fell asleep in one of the bedrooms in the house, and in the middle of the night, she remembers kind of being woken up by voices in the hallway of people asking, "Hey, where's Katie?" Tracy was half asleep, so she was thinking in her state of mind, people were asking like, "Hey, where's Katie in the house? Did she go to the restroom? Has anyone seen her? Did she fall asleep in a bedroom on the couch somewhere?" Not like, "Where's Katie in the city?" sort of situation. So Tracy fell back asleep, never leaving the room. When the sun rose, Joe, the boyfriend, knocked on the bedroom door where Tracy was sleeping, asking if she had heard from Katie, that they didn't know where she was. Tracy immediately tried to call Katie, trying to go grab her phone, but her phone was at the house, left behind. Katie didn't have her phone. Tracy then asked Joe immediately if they had gotten into an argument, whether Katie was mad at Joe, but he denied both of them, and he claimed he didn't even know when she left. Tracy thought, okay, you know what? Katie must have walked back home because her car's still here. This is not far from our own house. So Tracy went home, and she expected to find Katie fast asleep in her bedroom, but when she arrived back at their shared house and checked Katie's room, she realized that it was empty and there was no sign of her ever being there that night before. The door was locked, her phone, purse, and wallet were still in her car located at the house party. So Tracy became pretty frantic. She was worried. She started calling all their friends who lived within some sort of walking distance in the neighborhood, asking them if, hey, did Katie kind of come in the middle of the night to your house and crash there? But they had all said no. They hadn't seen Katie. So Tracy was full of nerves, and she called Joe again, asking him if anything actually happened between the couple and was he lying to her. And this time his story was different from the one he told Tracy earlier. The pair had gotten into an argument at the house party, but he didn't know where Katie had stormed off to. Joe wouldn't elaborate any further on what the argument was about. And Tracy didn't ask because she was just so focused on finding Katie right now. The couple getting into an argument wasn't really an unusual thing. In fact, the first question that Tracy came up with when she tried to call and couldn't find Katie was asking him, had they gotten into a fight that morning? Tracy just needed to find Katie, and Katie was without her belongings. So this really worried her, that her close friend maybe had gotten hit by a car, walking late at night, she was intoxicated. So Tracy, being very proactive, decided to call all the local hospitals in the city to see if a woman in her early 20s had been admitted, but then didn't know who she was because obviously her wallet was in her car. So she was kind of a Jane Doe, but that led nowhere. Tracy thought, okay, Katie got arrested walking home, for public intoxication, and she decided, I'm gonna call the local jail. But again, that led nowhere. Tracy was really covering all the bases here. This was during a time before social media where her friend wasn't in their house and she hadn't been seen for a couple hours, so Tracy knew something was wrong. Today, I think if your roommate wasn't home and you're so used to them being home, many of us would kind of write it off. But Tracy was so proactive, and we need to give her credit for that. So Tracy had Joe and his friends driving around the neighborhood to see if Katie had maybe fallen asleep on a corner or maybe on a neighbor's yard, and they just needed to find her. She was intoxicated. Maybe she just fell asleep walking home. Joe wasn't worried though, and it was odd because in fact, he was actually more exasperated. Like, this is really what I'm doing on my Sunday, on my holiday weekend, not worried that his very own girlfriend was missing. No one could locate her, and all her belongings were in her car that he seemingly was driving around. Tracy was very frustrated with him and the situation, and as time went on where they couldn't find Katie, Joe finally became more worried. Now at this point, Tracy pretty much had exhausted all of her options, so she called Katie's parents, Jayanne and Dave, who lived in Carlsbad, New Mexico, over 3 hours and 200 miles away going east from Las Cruces. Jayanne answered Tracy's call, asking if she had heard from her daughter, but Jayanne hadn't, asking what was going on. Tracy then began to tell the parents everything she knew up to this point, telling Jayanne that Katie and Joe had gotten into an argument and Katie had left the friend's house they were at, assuming that she was walking off to let off some of that anger and trying to scare Joe. Tracy then told the mom that no one had heard from Katie and she really wanted to report her to the police, and Jayanne told her to do so. After the two women ended their phone call, Tracy called the LCPD, and that's when she caught them up on everything. She gave them that photo of Katie and all the information she had up to that point. And during this time, where no one knew but the police that a body had been found out in the desert earlier in the day, so the police decided to take this photo that Tracy gave them, telling Tracy that they were going to go check some information down at the station that they had, and then they'll be back right away. In reality, police were taking this photo of Katie down to where her body was being kept at the local hospital and comparing the photo to the body. They came back to the girl's home within an hour, asking Tracy if she would come with them to identify someone. Now, Tracy got pretty excited. She thought, oh, they had arrested a woman and they just couldn't tell me because maybe she wasn't booked yet, that was found roaming around the neighborhood, intoxicated, and now she has to come in and identify this person as Katie, pay the bail, get her out of there, and everyone would laugh because this was a funny situation, you know? For the next night out, they would all have a good chuckle about it, like, remember that time, Katie, that you walked around the neighborhood and got arrested and you forgot to call me to come bail you out, so we were searching the city looking for you, sort of thing. But as you can guess, that is not at all what happened. The officer drove Tracy down to a local hospital and escorted her down to the basement where the coroner's office was, where they were keeping the body found in the desert, in a body bag, unzipped to about her chest area. Tracy screamed. She saw just a part of Katie's head and a silver earring, and she knew without having a doubt in her mind that she was looking at her friend, and it was Katie. Upon further inspection, her close friend's face held a look of pain, like Katie died while she was in pain. And Tracy fell to the floor, sobbing, just asking herself who would end her friend's life. It couldn't be anyone they knew. Katie was so loved by everyone around her. Tracy knew this had to be a complete stranger who would do this. The police had an identification to the woman's body that they had found in the desert, and it was 22-year-old local college student Katie Sepich. So who was Katie Sepich? Katie was everything. You know, the people you see out and about and you're like, wow, that person is sunshine. That person is an enigma. That person needs to be protected at all costs. Like, the world revolves around. That person was Katie. My gosh, I never knew this woman, obviously, but I just know she was this person by the way people talk about her, by the pictures you see of her. She was an amazing person. So I want to take a couple minutes to talk about Katie and who she was. Katie was a sister, a daughter, a friend, and according to her father, Dave, she was a ball of fire from day one, from the moment she was born. I have a quote from him that I want to read out loud, so here we go. Katie was quite something. She was a ball of fire from day one. She was going 90 miles per hour her whole life. She was the eldest of 3 children. Her full name was Catherine J. Sepich, born to parents Dave and J. Sepich. Katie had one younger brother, AJ, and then she also had a younger sister, Caroline. AJ idolized his bigger sister, rightfully so. In the Dateline documentary, a bunch of the Sepich family home videos were shown, and Katie was always there with her siblings, playing with them, just being the best big sister possible. Caroline said the following on her, and I quote, "Her whole life was an adventure. She was really sweet and outgoing, but a little bossy. She liked to plan things and make her adventures go her way. She would say, 'This is what we're doing. Let's go.'" AJ also gave this statement on his big sister. Katie was a lot to handle, but also a lot to have behind you and on your side. She was always my protector, but also my best friend. It wasn't just Katie's family that adored her. Her friends did also. Tracy remembers that Katie was such a shining light, and everyone around them noticed. Amy Bonhart, another one of Katie's friends, stated, and I quote, "I feel that you don't always see somebody who was as beautiful as her, but also self-deprecating. She was willing to laugh at herself and make fun of herself and be the butt of the joke and still do it with grace and crack everyone up." Katie was gorgeous, like 2000s supermodel gorgeous, or old-time big Hollywood actress gorgeous. But she wasn't only beauty, she was brain. She already had her bachelor's degree, but she was getting her master's. She had a great sense of humor and was an overall great person. The kind of person who wouldn't take herself too seriously, loving a good joke, and just loved to be the life of the party. Katie was set on changing the world, and she did so even in her death, which we'll be talking talking about later on. I know this term is overused nowadays, but Katie could be described as one thing, and that's an it girl. Like, she is everything. She was beautiful. She had the brains, the wit, the determination. She was the person that everyone looked up to. She was just so much bigger than life, like an angel walking on earth. So while Tracy was IDing Katie, Dave, her dad, was already driving the 200 miles to Las Cruces to search for his daughter. All he knew was that she's missing, and once he found her, he was gonna give her a stern talking to about how it's not okay to freak everyone out, like that everyone was worried about her. However, sadly, that would never happen. Once Dave arrived in the college town, he was greeted by a police captain, a minister, and a victim's advocate. And that's when he realized that his daughter didn't just have a wild night out partying, but instead something was seriously amiss. They told Dave that Katie's body had been found that morning. However, they were unable to ID her because she had no personal belongings on her. Dave broke down, and he remembers just being in a haze, walking down that basement hospital hallway towards the coroner's office, the body bag being zipped down, and seeing his beloved daughter's face and just falling to the floor, full of grief. Dave still remembers being in this haze, walking out of the hospital, heart heavy, knowing that that was the last time he would ever see his child, and just leaving his heart behind with her. Outside the hospital, Dave had to collect himself a little bit in order to call his wife, Katie's mom, Jan, and inform her that their eldest baby was gone. When Jan answered the call, all Dave could muster out was she was gone, that he had just seen her and she was gone. Jan hoped that this was all some dream and she would just wake up in a couple minutes and her daughter would be perfectly fine. But earlier in that day, she had this feeling. We like to call it mother's intuition, and I think that's what this was. But since the moment Jan had awoken that morning on August 31st, 2003, Jan had uncharacteristically anxious-like feeling, like something was wrong with her child. Jan and Dave had to inform their two other children of what happened to their sister. AJ was in Albuquerque, New Mexico at this point, over 3 hours and 220 miles away from Las Cruces, where his father was, and over 4.5 hours and 280 miles away from his hometown of Carlsbad. He immediately left the city where he was beginning his college life, his college career, to be with his family. He said the news of his sister's passing was just a blow to his soul, not knowing how to keep moving forward in life with no real perspective, insight of what the next minute would bring, if his next breath would even come out. Now, Caroline was only 9 years old. She was old enough to understand death, what it was, but not enough to understand and grasp the true meaning of it. Her visual memories in her mind directly after her sister's passing are very crisp, like they were recorded in 4K for her to watch back at a later date. But the color is so dull in these memories, muted and devoid of life. Caroline explains it's like if a bright light, as glowing as the sun, her sister, full of love, is just shut off with a flick of a switch, because in the blink of an eye, her sister, her light, was gone and taken from her. There was this systematic shift in the Sepich family's dynamic. Katie was kind of like the nucleus that held the family together. She held them at the center. She was their ball of energy, the source of life, and suddenly whoever decided to do this to their family member had taken their powerhouse, their nucleus, their mitochondria. She was gone. Her parents look back fondly at all the home videos with their eldest in them. Katie was a very rambunctious child, full of energy, and she never changed growing up. AJ believed that that was the best part of his sister. Katie led the Sepich clan, always at the front, running with the ideas. And AJ was just her hype man, her backup dancer, backup singer. Katie was the center of attention though, but not in a bad way, not in a like, all attention needs to be on me constantly, no one else can have attention. She just loved to be over the top. She was an amazing sister though, and she was fiercely protective of AJ. As the eldest sister, Katie took on the usual role that elder daughters take on, both being the sister and mother to her siblings. She was their best friend. If AJ was being bullied by a classmate in school, Katie would step in, not Jan. The pair were two peas in a pod, just them against the world. And soon Caroline would come along, and Katie became an even fiercer protector over her young siblings. There was a sort of large age gap between Katie, AJ, and their youngest sister, Caroline, but they never let that affect their dynamic. Soon, Katie, though, was moving to Las Cruces for college, and when her family asked what she was going to do with that MBA she was now going for, she told Jan she didn't know yet, but she was sure for one thing: she would change the world. And Jan believed her. You know, most kids say that they're going to change the world, but they are not very idealistic and they're just kind of naive, but she knew her daughter was going to change the world. And Katie would. Her death would not be in vain. Jan would make sure of it. But at this moment, the Sepich, they didn't know what to do. They had a long journey ahead of them, and they needed to figure out who would harm Katie. Jan and Dave were together for 32 years when their eldest was taken away from them. They were determined to keep their family going and to fight for justice for Katie. Jan knew whoever did this had to have been a stranger because no one who knew Katie would ever do this to her. Katie had this sort of thing where she could tell her friends or family a little something, and maybe it was a little mean or a little harsh or maybe a little controversial, but no one would get angry at her. Like if someone else said that, they would get in trouble, but not Katie. So this had to be an outsider who harmed her. Local news stations began to cover the case while police began interviewing anyone who could come forward, having seen her that night, along with her friends and family. They got in some local call-in tips, but that all led nowhere. Police tried to canvass the area, thinking a neighbor might have seen something, but nothing came of it. As I mentioned, Katie had gone bar hopping the night before on August 30th, and it was a holiday weekend. So many officers were not clocked in, having taken the holiday weekend off to spend it with family. So come Tuesday, September 2nd, a pile of work had piled up at the station. So what I mean by this is holiday weekend. A lot of the officers took time off. Maybe they went out of town, went out to eat, went to the movies, did some sort of activity in the town. So there was a lot less officers on duty at the time. So the streets weren't being as paroled as much, a lot less people on duty. And come Tuesday, they had to go through this pile of paperwork that had piled up. So people who got arrested over the weekend now had to be processed. People who got tickets, people who were pulled over, all this sort of paperwork had to get filed through and assigned to different people. So come Monday, as officers were filing through these new cases, going over these new charges and stuff and the arrests of the weekend and trying to compile who needed to be assigned what, Katie's case had kind of gotten lost in it. It took a couple days for a lead investigator to be assigned to Katie's case, and that person was Robert Jones from the Sheriff's Department. From there, he would have to be caught up to even more speed of what had gone on. So I did mention an officer named Mark Myers, who was also working on the case, and he was the one who was sent out to Tracy and with Dave. And their first order of business was to go back to Tracy and Katie's house, where Tracy claims to have found a piece of evidence by her roommate's bedroom window. This was the first sign that anyone had found that Katie had made it back to their house. Outside of the window of Katie's bedroom, her shoes were found, her sandals that she was wearing that night. And on her window, the screen that is usually there was gone. This home that they lived in was landscaped with gravel, and in the gravel found by the window and the shoes, it was in disarray. It's as if Katie had been dragged through it, fighting back against her attacker in a struggle. So police now knew one thing for certain: whether Katie was killed and assaulted right outside her own bedroom window or at another location before being dumped in the landfill that bordered with the desert where she would be found, she had fought back. During her autopsy, under Katie's fingernails were actually the DNA of her attacker, and the same DNA would be found all over her body. She had clawed her attacker so much to take skin cells. Her autopsy also revealed that Katie Sepich was sexually assaulted and then murdered using strangulation. Investigators only hoped that the DNA found under her fingernails would lead to a match in the system to find her killer. Police began asking everyone that was at that party around her to submit their own DNA samples to test against the ones found under her fingernails. And everyone said yes, everyone agreed to it, except for one person, Joe Bitt, the boyfriend. Police knew it was time to now bring him in for questioning. I have mentioned how this relationship was not the healthiest, and when reviewing security footage from one of the bars with the group of friends that they went to that evening, Joe and Katie were seen together, hands intertwined, and they left the party together to go to a friend's house. That's when things would go south. Many people at this house party were quick to bring up the fact that the couple had gotten into an argument, and that Katie was extremely upset after walking in on her boyfriend, Joe, kissing another girl. This was just another detail that Joe did not tell Tracy when she asked why they had gotten into a fight, if they got into an argument, and one that he wouldn't tell police when he gave his first statement. Police needed to get to the bottom of this because in their minds, Joe was the prime suspect, the unfaithful boyfriend who had not been 100% honest with anyone about anything that happened that night. And in the interrogation room, police laid it all out for Joe, how he was unfaithful and he needed to be honest with them now. Joe seemed emotional but composed, and finally he began to offer more details. He said when they had gotten back to that house from the bar, Katie was mad at him because she had to pull him off another girl at this house party. Katie had then left the house quickly after that, and he went to go grab another friend to go join him to come look for Katie. But her car was still at the house. And after a quick little look around the neighborhood, he went back to the house party. He did say that he drove by her house, which again, this was in like the same sort of neighborhood, enough that she could walk home. Everyone thought she walked home. Joe admitted that he just didn't care. He wasn't very faithful in the relationship, and apparently this seemed to not have been the first time that he had been unfaithful to Katie, according to some reports. He went on to admit that he didn't try to call her after coming back looking for her before he fell asleep. Police thought this wouldn't be the first time that an unhealthy relationship between a couple would get into a fight. One of them storms off during the fight and the other follows them to continue the argument elsewhere. And it wasn't a secret to their close friends that this relationship wasn't the healthiest. I mean, Tracy's first question once she found out that Katie was missing was, have you guys gotten into a fight? And he lied about it. But this time their fight was in public in front of all their friends. So maybe Joe felt like Katie had embarrassed him. And the allegations up into this point of his infidelity were finally confirmed right in front of everyone's eyes. Everyone could now see Katie wasn't lying. He is a cheat. So he chased after her. And maybe something in the feat of his rage, he hurts her. And he decides to dump her body in the desert, where they decompose at a faster rate. Joe's behavior didn't give the detectives any doubts that he probably was involved. So they asked him straight out if he ended Katie's life. But he denied it and said that night he was just being stupid, too drunk, and he cheated. But that wasn't enough for police. He needed to be ruled out as the main suspect. And the only way to do that was to get his DNA for them to test against the skin cells found under Katie's nails. Out of all the people there at this party, 30 to 40 people who willingly gave their DNA, Joe wouldn't. But why though? He knows he's the main suspect, so why not put the investigators' doubt to rest and just give a simple sample? He admits that he and a friend were the only two to leave the party to go looking for Katie. But he also admits that he never got out of the car to look around. He just drove around the neighborhood at a very low speed, never knocked on her front door to see if she got in home. So detectives kept doubting his story. Then they got a hold of Joe's call log and found that he had called Katie's phone a few times, but never mentioned that he had her phone. Now let me explain. I mentioned before that Katie's car was still at this house party. Her little red sedan. So that means she left on foot, and in the car was her purse, which had her phone, her wallet, her ID, her house keys. So how was Katie supposed to get into her own home with none of the above? To detectives, it seemed like Joe was calling her cell phone repeatedly that he knew was still in her car, trying to build some sort of alibi. And within days of Katie's body being found, Joe left back to Gallup, New Mexico. Initially, he was only in town for the holiday weekend to collect the remaining stuff of his, but you would think your girlfriend was just found dead over the weekend and you wouldn't stick around for a bit longer. But no, that just wasn't the case. Joe Bish told investigators that he would come back sometime to Las Cruces if they needed anything else. And they did. They needed a DNA sample from him, along with more questions they needed to ask. However, detectives called him a little while after his leave, and he told them that he would not be returning to the college town again. In fact, he had gotten an attorney and wouldn't be helping this case any longer, nor giving a DNA sample. Now, this made Joe's actions even more suspicious to detectives. How could this man who was planning the future with Katie, a life spent together, decide not to help solve her murder? Unless maybe he was involved. Though Joe's attorney expressed that he had changed his mind to help aid in the investigation because he didn't like how police were investigating the case. Now keep this in mind. This was the very early days of the investigation, so police were going through the routine checklist that they do for every case. Identifying the body, retracing the victim's last steps, interviewing everyone they had last seen, and asking for DNA samples to be tested on the DNA they found on the body. From there, once all of these options were exhausted and they didn't lead anywhere, then detectives would move on to other avenues. Joe Bish could deny all he wanted that he wasn't Katie's killer through his lawyer, but at this moment in the investigation, he was the number one suspect, the boyfriend, the spouse, they always are. So until he gave that DNA sample, he was at that top of the list. So detectives went another round. They had Joe followed in hopes at some point in his day he would throw away a can of soda that he had drank in, or maybe an iced coffee with a straw that he had finished, and they could collect that cup to test his DNA. Now, due to the skin cells found under Katie's fingernails, they knew she had roughened up her attacker. She had scratched them somewhere to leave some nasty wounds on their body. Since they hadn't gotten Joe to come back for more questioning, they couldn't ask him to undress to see if he had any sort of marks like this on him. Joe Bish, the main suspect, was so untouchable to police. Officers knew that he was their only lead at this point, so it was time to tell the Sepich family what they knew. Dave and Jeanne just didn't understand. The evidence was stacking up against Joe, but it broke their hearts. This was the man that they trusted to take care of their daughter, someone that they had approved of. So how could they have been so blindsided by Joe's true nature? Jeanne had always told her kids to make of the list of things that were total deal breakers for them if a partner did them. Jeanne and Katie had always been very close. Katie would tell her mom absolutely everything. And when she called to tell Jeanne about Joe, that was the first thing that she said. He passed the list. There were no deal breakers. Now Dave, as any good dad's most important thing was that he wanted someone that would treat his daughter right. And to him, Joe was a polite, nice gentleman type. And he thought Joe adored Katie, that the world was in her eyes. The family could not believe it, that Katie left the house party and her last moment alive were at the hands of the man that she loved, ending her life. They were so sure that the person who had ended their daughter's life was someone who didn't love their daughter. It couldn't have been the person tasked with taking care of her, loving her, cherishing her, protecting her from all the evil in the world, not the person to be causing the harm. Joe was supposed to attend Katie's funeral, but when the Sepich friends and family found out that he was the main suspect, they contacted Katie's friends to tell him that it was better if he stayed far away, and it wouldn't be a good idea if he showed up. Joe Bish didn't attend her funeral in Carlsbad, New Mexico, and he probably was the only person in Katie's life who had ever met her who didn't attend. Practically everyone who had crossed lives with Katie was at the funeral. Over 1,000 people were in attendance, that the church had to set up loudspeakers outside so the people who had come could mourn the loss and hear the service from outside. When it was AJ's turn to get up and go to the podium and talk about his sister, the words were unable to come out. All he could remember was the constant stream of tears going down his face that day, telling everyone in attendance that if they had a sibling, to please call them. Just call them. Tell them how much you love and appreciate them. Something he would never be able to tell Katie again. While family and friends celebrated Katie's life, investigators were cramped outside in the parking lot. They knew Joe probably wasn't going to show, but they also knew the pattern of perpetrators' behavior, showing up to their victim's funeral. So police took photos and videos of all the cars that were there to see if any of the tires resembled the tracks that they found at the crime scene. They knew that the tracks probably belonged to a small pickup truck and hoped that maybe one of the mourners drove a car like this, but that led nowhere. Detective Myers also decided that if the killer didn't attend the funeral, maybe they would visit her gravesite. So they put a hidden camera near her headstone and thought maybe the killer would come and confess to clear their guilty conscience. However, this plan was also not fruitful. One of the mini cemetery sprinklers had actually turned on and knocked the camera over, and no one was suspicious whoever came to visit Katie's grave. Detectives were running out of leads. They had very little evidence to arrest Joe, nothing more than suspicions, so they turned to subpage ads, offering a monetary reward for any information, and made sure that Katie's case stayed in the media constantly. Dave and Jeanne felt like the detectives would find out who did this eventually. They just needed to present their family as a united front. But behind closed doors, the youngest Sepich sibling, Caroline, saw something different. The constant sorrows and sadness in her parents' eyes as the days would go on, and her brother's eyes that would dull as days kept going. The case wasn't getting many leads when Dave and Jeanne shared something odd about their daughter. It was an unusual fact that strangers wouldn't be able to know. Katie Sepich could not scream. Her natural speaking voice was very low and it was also pretty husky. So when she was a child, she couldn't scream. She would try, but she was never able to produce the sound. This explained so much to detectives. They knew that Katie had made it home, evident by her sandals and disrupted gravel near her window. But neighbors had said that they may have heard some sort of struggle, but they heard no cries for help because Katie couldn't produce the sounds needed to cry for help. This fact became so much grimmer when police learned that Tracy's mother was there visiting the night that Katie was murdered. She was asleep in that very house, just a few feet from Katie's window in another bedroom, and she heard nothing because Katie's voice didn't allow her to scream, no matter how much she tried. Nothing less, police knew that Katie did fight back. She fought. Officers knew that there had to be visible marks on her attacker, but after a couple days, those wounds would heal, and if they didn't find the attacker in those couple days, they would have no evidence of that. Katie's jewelry was also missing from her body. She was was wearing that new ring that Joe had got her, that birthstone promise ring hybrid, and she was also wearing another ring and a watch on her wrist that night that she went out. So police searched every single pawn shop in the tri-state area, every single one in the state of New Mexico, in West Texas, in eastern Arizona, in southern Colorado, every single state that was bordering New Mexico, they checked. And they didn't tell the press about this, especially because of that birthstone ring, that new ring that only really her friends knew about. They knew if they found that specific ring, they would find the killer. If they found any of her jewelry, they would find the killer. But if the public knew about this jewelry that was now a new lead, the killer would probably dispose of that jewelry somehow instead of trying to sell it for some quick cash. They were never able to locate any of her jewelry through pawn shop searches though. Cops then moved on to another motive. Katie worked as a waitress at a local Mexican restaurant that was pretty popular in the Las Cruces area, a place called
El Sombrero
Patio Cafe. Katie was a very beautiful young lady, and they thought, well, what if one of her customers became a little weird and they had developed a weird obsession with her and they just began stalking Katie? They exhausted every single avenue with this hunch, but nothing came of it. Also, if that was the case, Katie told Jeanne everything. So her mom knew every little detail about her life, and if Katie had felt odd about something, Jeanne would know. So let's get back to the DNA found on Katie. The lab results showed that all of it belonged to only one man. So they ran that DNA against the national database, thinking the person would show up if it was a stranger. The DNA wasn't in the system. This just supported the theory that Katie may have known her attacker, and that the killer had to be Joe Bish for the investigators. However, when Tracy Waters, Katie's close friend and roommate, heard of this theory, Tracy claimed it was because Joe was really embarrassed about his behavior, and he no longer engaged with detectives' investigation. Wasn't due to him making that choice, but rather his parents made that choice. Tracy claimed she knew personally that Joe's parents hired an attorney trying to protect the son that they thought was innocent. But this behavior had gone on for far too long. Detective Myers and Jones were trying to get a court-ordered warrant for Joe's DNA. The Donna Ana County District Attorney, Susana Martinez, wouldn't approve to the warrant due to the belief that the detectives didn't have a probable cause that she could agree to. Myers disagreed though. They already had DNA from every other person at that party except for Joe. He was the last one that they needed in order to cross off this list of suspects and explore other avenues. Joe had admitted being one of the only two people to go looking for Katie that night. He even tried to create an alibi when he had her phone all evening long. But this was now a high-profile case, and in a case that is about to have a lot of eyes on it, the prosecutors had to try extra hard and cover all their bases, so when they do go to trial, the defendant can't claim that their civil rights were broken during the investigation. So DA Martinez wouldn't budge. So Detective Jones remembered something from his interview with Joe before he stopped talking to police. He told them that Katie and himself had had sex on August 29th, the day before the bar hopping. They wondered if any of Joe's skin cells, semen, body hair, or any other form of DNA may have been on Katie's sheets that they collected from her room as possible evidence. So they sent the sheets in for DNA testing, and while waiting for the results, Tracy was still living in this house she once shared with Katie. Every day she would wake up thinking that her best friend was just down the hall, peacefully asleep, but then reality would set in. Tracy began to deal with intensive anxiety that someone was watching their house and knew her daily movements, her schedule. If it wasn't a stranger, then someone they knew personally was her friend's killer. That had probably been inside her house before, someone she probably had offered something to drink to, had a meal with, and that was her best friend's murderer. Still though, Tracy was one of the few believers that Joe Bish was not the killer. But as time passed, she wished she could just be like the majority and believe that he was capable of doing something like this. Then Katie would have justice. She would be wrong, but there would finally be justice. A few months after detectives had sent the sheets in, the results were back. Tracy would finally know if her gut was right. The set hitches could possibly be getting the justice. Male DNA was found on Katie's sheets, but it wasn't certain if it was Joe's. Detectives knew Joe was a cheater, but they were sure that Katie wasn't. But it was also horrible because now, 3 months later, detectives were back at square one, and they had no leads. They had no idea who the killer was. It could be anyone in the world. When news got back to Joe about the vetting results that cleared him of any suspicion, he was finally willing to give a DNA sample. DA Martinez contacted Joe's attorney, informing them that they had gotten a male sample of DNA from Katie's sheets, and they knew that the couple had intercourse just the day before they went clubbing, and it wasn't a match for the skin cells found under Katie's fingernails. And DA Martinez said, if you really want to clear your client's name, now is the time to come in and have Joe give his DNA. And he did. Joe Bish, Katie Sepich's boyfriend, the cheating boyfriend, was not the killer. Tracy felt some sort of vindication. She was relieved that she wasn't wrong and felt bad that Joe had been victimized by the public. The Sepiches didn't share the sympathy though. They felt like if Joe had just given his DNA all those months earlier, like everyone else who was at that party did, this could have been cleared up right away. And they wouldn't have to had dealt with the thought that the man that they trusted their daughter with could possibly harm her. They were rightfully upset because we're 3 months behind on finding their daughter's killer. A man that was still on the loose in Goddess knows where, and Las Cruces was a relatively safe city, just like El Paso. It is a college town with very low criminal rates, but Katie's murder had shaken the whole community. People were fearful that this killer was still on the loose. Many college students were fearful that the school advised them not to walk home alone at any point, and they were worried that if young women weren't safe on the streets. But then a new lead came in the form of a random attack on another young woman. One that would lead Detective Myers and Jones all the way to the Midwest, Wisconsin to be exact. 11 days earlier, in mid-August of 2003, over 1,500 miles away in Green Bay, Wisconsin, their local police department had a eerily similar case to Katie's. A woman walked outside of the bar late at night, headed towards a car after getting into an argument with her own boyfriend, and 2 individuals picked her up. These 2 people pulled this woman into the car, driving off to a secluded farm area where they sexually assaulted her, then attempted to end her life through strangulation. Those details were very oddly similar to what happened to Katie. But what ticked detectives off even further was these men then poured some sort of igniter onto her body to try and light her on fire. By all good graces in the universe, the woman survived. I went searching for this case and I found a couple articles from Wisconsin from local news station, but from what I could find, the victim did choose to keep herself anonymous, her identity private, and rightfully so. So I don't know her name. I just will be referring to her as the woman. So this woman, in a bad state, crawled to a nearby house, rang the doorbell, where the homeowners then called 911. While the ambulance was on the way, the owners aided the woman, keeping her as comfortable as possible and asking questions about what happened. She knew that she was lit on fire, and she knew her attackers were 2 men, one tall and one short, but in her state, she couldn't give much more. The victim would eventually give descriptions of her attackers after receiving medical treatment. She told police she was abducted from a local Green Bay nightclub, taken to a rural farm area where the 2 attackers sexually assaulted her, attempted to strangle her, then doused her in lighter fluid, attempting to burn her alive and leave her to die. She was able to put the flames out and get help, but one thing she remembers about her attackers was how they were laughing getting into the car, turning on their headlights and speeding away. The woman at the hospital suffered respiratory failure, and 61% of her body was badly burned with 2nd to 3rd degree burn. Luckily, from what I can tell, she is still alive today, and she will get the justice she deserves. The woman's description of her attackers aided in the sketches of the man who drove a truck, just like Detective Myers and James theorized. That field that the woman was taken out to was super close to a dairy farm, and when the sketches of these attackers came out, the manager of the farm called police to inform them that the men were his own employees, handing over all the information he had on them. Their names were 25-year-old Gregorio Morales and 22-year-old Juan Nieto. And according to their manager, after the attack, both men left town, but Gregorio Morales had come back to work at the farm sometime later. The manager decided to help with the investigation, and by doing so, he gave Morales a can of soda to drink, and then when the can was empty, he collected the can and put the bottle into a plastic bag and handed that bag over to the police to test the DNA from. The other man, Nieto, would be found in Georgia and extradited to Wisconsin. But this lead gets even weirder. Gregorio Morales was the one who drove the truck, and after this attempted murder on the woman, he fled to New Mexico. So detectives believed that he was in that state in New Mexico during Katie's death. When DNA came back from the soda can, it was a match for DNA found on the woman, but it wasn't a match for Katie. So that that man was not Katie's killer. However, Juan Nieto was still at large and his DNA wasn't in the system, so he remained a suspect in Katie's case. And the other woman, this was her other attack. This is where Katie's legacy was born. You see, the Sepiches didn't understand how a man who probably had a record didn't have his DNA in the system. Jeanne came up with a bold plan to overhaul the system, a form of justice for families
of victims,
so they don't have to wait around for DNA to be collected. When a repeat offender, DNA should already be in the system. It was now the summer of 2004, and Nieto had finally been extradited to Wisconsin. His DNA was tested, sent to the lab, and it was a match for the Wisconsin case, but not for Katie's case. In 2005, the woman's case would go to trial, and Giorgio Morales would take a plea deal and be sentenced to 50 years in prison, and Juan Nieto would choose to go to trial, and he'd be sentenced to 70 years in prison. So this odd case had no real relation to Katie's. It was almost a year later, in late 2004, and one of the head detectives on Katie's case had decided to put his retirement papers in. Robert Jones, his father had gotten pretty ill, and after 23 years on the force, he decided to turn in his badge to help take care of his father. But he didn't want to have to stop, but he needed to take care of his loved ones. He just wanted to find justice for Katie and for the Sepiches, but he was at a crossroads because his father was sick and he didn't know who would be assigned to take on this case to replace him and if this new person would go to bat as much as he had for Katie. Jeanne remembers getting the call about Detective Jones' retirement, telling him that the team had regularly been searching the national DNA database to see if any new uploaded profiles matched Katie's killer. Jeanne remembers how a light bulb just kind of struck her in that moment. The monster who did this to her daughter was probably a repeat offender. He had to have been arrested for something prior. So this monster was so deranged that he had to have been arrested when his fingerprints would be taken, that his cheek would be swabbed, and his mugshot would be taken. That is how they could identify him. But that's when Robert Jones informed her that that is not how the law worked. In fact, it is actually illegal to do that. In fact, in almost every state, taking DNA from the convicted was normal, but not people who were arrested. So I know what you're thinking. Serenity, well, in my state, it's normal to be fingerprinted, cheek swabbed at the same time of the arrest. And you're correct. But that is the regulation now, almost 21 years later. And you have the Sepiches to thank for that. So let me explain a bit. Jeanne was flabbergasted. How could the people that were arrested not have to hand over their DNA? They had already done something wrong. This stirred something in her. It was wrong. If a person is accused of committing a serious crime and are arrested for it, then the time frame between arrest and conviction could mean a family spending years with unanswered questions. And there's probably someone out there that the arrestee has harmed. That time frame needed to be shortened. And Jeanne found any and all resources on the market to educate her on DNA and the justice system. She learned everything she could. Caroline, Katie's youngest sibling, was now 11 years old at this point, just 2 years since her sister's passing, and she began to get very involved with her mom's work. She began reading all these books herself and educating herself on the justice system and how DNA worked in this setting. Caroline, since childhood, called herself a nerd. She loved reading and she just loved learning. So as a family, Dave, Jeanne, AJ, and Caroline had multiple family discussions about how officers had to go through certain hoops to get suspects' DNA and what it took to get tested, along with the role it played in convictions. It was during one of these discussions that they came up with the idea that their state, New Mexico, had to begin to expand DNA testing and a database by taking DNA swabs from everyone who's arrested of any felony charge. Their idea kept expanding though. This concept to help other families out who have lost their loved ones to the crime kept these Sepiches together. DA Susana Martinez began to help the family in an effort to change the way that the state's DNA laws worked. Susana was on the board for the state's District Attorney Association, and she was a key force in getting the law passed and signed into state legislation. Time kept moving though. Katie's killer was no closer to being found, and soon it was 2006 when the Secretary of State Representatives submitted the drafted bill for this proposed new concept bill to the New Mexico state legislator for them to review. The secretary told Jeanne Sepich, who was spearheading this whole thing, that the effort to win was a race against the clock, seeing as it was late January, early February of 2006. New Mexico only had a 30-day long session this year where they would hear about all the new proposed bills and then sign the ones that they agreed with into law. They told her it would be nearly impossible to get a bill signed in 30 days. But Katie had to get that fighting spirit from somewhere, and that someone was Jeanne, who did not like to be told what what was possible and what wasn't. She was going to get it done. So she decided she was going to move from her city, Carlsbad, to the state's capital of Santa Fe, New Mexico for this 30-day session. And this is over 4 hours and 240 miles away from her home. She did not take no for an answer. This bill was just way too important to her and to other victims' families. Once Jeanne arrived in Santa Fe, she learned that many of the legislators felt sympathy for her case, for her situation, but they didn't want to change the law as it existed. They felt it would be unconstitutional as a violation against the Fourth Amendment, which protects citizens from unreasonable search and seizure, and DNA is considered one of those because it's collected by putting a cotton swab in the person's mouth, which is so much more invasive than taking fingerprints. Jeanne thought that excuse was nonsense though. Fingerprints are already taken from arrestees, and DNA is the modern fingerprints. I will tell you though, Jeanne was way ahead of her time, okay? Because remember when most iPhones would unlock with like Touch ID, your fingerprint? Police are not allowed to force you to unlock it. Even now, phones unlock with your face, and police legally should not be allowed to make you unlock it because that is your biometric data. That is what Jeanne was arguing. So Jeanne stayed in Santa Fe, armed with months of her previous research, working nonstop to convince legislators that her bill wasn't violating the Fourth Amendment. Jeanne would arrive at the courthouse every single morning by 7 a.m., then stayed outside every single night to 8 p.m. when most of the representatives would leave. Out of the 112 New Mexico state legislators, Jeanne would tell 108 of them face-to-face in a conversation would explain the bill. Katie's family didn't want any other family to have to deal with the same suffering. They could create real-life change for these families. Not only that, but they hoped that this law would actually help them catch Katie's killer. They just knew all it was time before the actions of the killer caught up to them. AJ struggled with this stuff. His beloved sister had become the poster child for legal action. Seeing her face on the news and around town hurt because Katie was no longer just his older sister, his beloved, but now she belonged to the world. She was put on center stage for the public. She had become the face of the movement in hopes to prevent suffering for other families. His struggles with coming to terms with his sister being gone, with no longer being able to grieve, because to the public she was the face of the movement, backed by the strong and resilient Sepiches. The 2006 legislative season came to an end. The Sepich family waited with bated breath, waiting for the voting results. And on a cold February morning, the proposed bill was passed, with only 5 of the legislators voting no. The law would become known as Katie's Law. That is not the legal, real name, but it's known as Katie's Law. The law mandated that anyone arrested for a violent felony crime at the time of arrest, law enforcement had to collect DNA samples, not at the time of conviction, which would take years for people to see. The Sepiches were elated with seeing how they could make a lasting difference and held hope that the new law would lead to a match in their own case, in Katie's case, along with other families waiting for justice. Jeanne's fight to change the law made her a warrior. It changed the way her kids viewed her, that they now knew they could do whatever they set their mind to. Early on in the days of Katie's murder, Jeanne and Dave promised each other that no matter what they had to do, they would keep their family together. And they did everything they could to find the strength to keep fighting. They found their next breath in fighting for justice, fighting for Katie, and making sure this never happened to a family again. They were going to turn this tragedy into good, and they never gave up pushing for Katie. However, Dave became consumed with the constant thought of who killed his daughter. He couldn't sleep. He was distracted at work, looking at his computer to look at maps to figure out who would be in the area that Katie disappeared from. Dave didn't want justice. He wanted vengeance. The Sepiches felt that Dave was doing so much to work on the case, almost as much as the detectives assigned to the case did. The years just kept on passing though, and they tried to do everything to keep Katie in the forefront of everyone's mind, doubling their reward money to $100,000 for a credible lead. Heck, they even got so desperate that they hired a famous psychic who told them that the killer would be found shortly before Christmas through DNA evidence. But time just kept ticking, and they began to lose hope. Maybe it was time to accept that justice would take a couple more years to get, and they had to begin moving on. Tracy Waters began to feel the same. The thought that maybe this person had gotten away with the crime that took her close friend, but this person was still on the loose, probably hurting other people. They knew the killer would reoffend eventually. This was not one one of those crimes that was one-off. You don't murder someone and that's a one-off crime. This was someone who could do this again. And they knew with Katie's law now in effect, he would be DNA swabbed at the time of his arrest. Katie's killer was out there, and he would strike soon at some point. But little did police know, he already did, years ago, just a couple months after Katie's murder, specifically in November of 2003. He had revealed himself, and police didn't know it yet. Two women were barricaded inside their shared apartment bathroom, and one of the women, named Anela, called 911. This wasn't the first time that the two women had seen this man before who was now in their apartment. He just now had gotten into the apartment, forced his way into it. The two ladies shared an apartment together. It's kind of like a townhome, kind of apartment-ish. It was a 2-story apartment and they had a home intruder. They were lucky that they would make it out of this attack alive. Anela and Leslie were roommates together. They were actually friends who met at NMSU and decided to move in together in a cute little 2-story apartment. It had 2 bedrooms, 2 baths. The apartment was just off campus, so it made it real easy to get to classes during the week. But they noticed something off in the fall of 2003. There was a man watching them from just outside the girls' bedroom windows. He glanced at them, and when he was caught, he would run off fleeing. This incident would spook them, and a couple weeks later, the same man was seen crouching below their home window, peering inside. This time though, Leslie had caught him. But this pattern would just continue. The girls would catch him. At times, they knew they were being watched. They couldn't find the man, but they knew it. At all times of the day, they would hear him bumping into the outside walls of their home, rubbing into the bushes. The man was not trying to be quiet by any means. They heard him almost as much as they saw him. He was constantly circling the apartment. No questions asked. This was the same man constantly trying to stalk them. And the pair was unsure as to what he was doing, but they weren't going to go check. They felt safer in their apartment than going out. Behind their apartment, they had a little mini backyard, and they began to find the gate that led to their backyard open. So they would close it once they found it open, and they'd place this little rock, a specific rock, next to the bottom of the gate. They knew if someone was coming into this gate that wasn't one of them two, that they would find out. They were making sure. And oftentimes that rock was moved. The gate was closed again, but the rock was moved. So to Anela and Leslie at first, they felt like it was a couple weird random moments, but then it became constant. They had an official stalker. So they changed their daily routines. They wouldn't leave the house at the same time every day. They would take different routes to school or to work. They would do everything in their power. Anela even took a self-defense class, and they notified their complex security team along with their neighbors about what was going on. Nothing changed though. The man never attempted to talk to any of the neighbors or the girls, never approached them. They were frightened, but they began to think maybe he was just harmless. He was just a weirdo. He was creepy, probably had no life, some sort of loser. He'd eventually get bored of them. However, that was not the case at all. On a rainy night in November of 2003, 2.5 months after Katie Sepich's murder, the girls weren't prepared for the horror that they would endure. Leslie was feeling kind of uneasy that night. She had actually called her boyfriend, who is now her husband, and she was telling him how she was scared. She had a bad feeling, she was really frightened, and she just asked him to stay on the phone with her as she fell asleep. That way she would have his calm presence verbally over the phone. He did that, and luckily Leslie was able to fall asleep, even with this pent-up anxiety. But at some point in the middle of the night, she woke up with a start. Unsure if maybe she just heard a loud noise or maybe someone was actually in the house. But she knew something in her was telling her to get up right this second, right now. Get out of bed and go to Anela's room now. So Leslie bolted from her bed, down the hallway, and to her roommate's bedroom. Somehow Anela also woke up, and she knew it. Call it a sixth sense, call it something, but she knew their stalker was in their house. Anela was in her room, and she was sitting up in bed, and she could see out her bedroom where the hallway bends and led into kind of where Leslie's room was. She saw from that bend that Leslie was running towards the room. But then she would also, at the same second, see another silhouette in that same corner. Once Leslie had made it into the room, Anela bolted the door lock. And it wasn't even a few seconds later that the man was rattling the door handle, trying to get in. It seemed that he left after a couple minutes, trying to get into the room, rattling that door. But he was in the house, and he was not leaving. He began to walk around the outside perimeter of the home to the window near Anela's bedroom, like he was trying to see if he could get into the house through her window. So the girls decided to lock themselves into Anela's en-suite bathroom. She called 911, and the two knew one thing. This man, their stalker, had picked the wrong girls. They would make it out of here alive. by hell or high water, they were making it out. And if anyone had to die that night, he would be the one to die because he chose the wrong people. They refused to become their stalker's victim. So they stayed barricaded in the bathroom on the phone with 911, trying to calm themselves down, trying to be level-headed. It took 3 more minutes for the Las Cruces Police Department to arrive at the girl's home and arrest the intruder. On his person, a sharp knife was found. There was no telling what he would have done to the girls that night, but they now had an identity. The man was 23-year-old Gabriel Avila, and a few months later, in 2004, he would be convicted of aggravated burglary and resisting arrest for the crime he committed that night in November. He was looking at a 9-year sentence, but in an act of extreme buffoonery, the judge decided that Avila could be let out on bond in order for him to get in order his personal affairs, which he claimed he needed to do. But as you can guess, he fled. I mean, the man was convicted of pretty aggressive things, and he was just let out on bond. But there's one key thing in this burglary conviction that would lead to Katie Sepich's murder finally being solved. However, first, police needed to find and apprehend this felon. He is fleeing from his 9-year sentence on his first charges. He was on the run for a year, but in 2005, he was recaptured and sent to prison to begin serving his 9-year sentence. And finally, his DNA was collected to be put in the database. Now, a common misconception, especially in true crime, you see it on shows like Law & Order and stuff, but that is that forensic science and DNA results take just a couple weeks to get back. But in reality, it can take months, even years. It took almost a full year for Avila's DNA to be processed in this new system and for it to come back as a hit for Katie Sepich. Detective Myers had been waiting years to make this call, and almost 3 years later, a friend of the sheriff's department who worked in the DNA processing center in New Mexico called Meyer and told him they have an important bit of information that he needs to know, and he needed to get to the office to hear it. The DNA evidence that Katie had clawed with the last breath of life to get on her attacker, it had a hit. Her killer had been identified as Gabriel Avila. Detective Myers immediately called the Sepiches with the great news. They were stunned into shock because after 3 years of bad leads, false hopes, and wrong turns, they finally had the killer using DNA evidence. But who was this man? Was it someone the police had on their radar at any point? Well, no. He was nowhere on police's radar, and he wouldn't have been found if it wasn't for DNA. The man being caught for the crime, like Jalen had theorized, was because of DNA. So who was Gabriel Adrian Avila? At the time of Katie's murder and the attack on Leslie and Anela, according to some reports, some say he's 33, others say he was 23 at the time. I am gonna go with 33 because that's how old he looks. He was a national of Mexico living in New Mexico. So what else is known about him? I did a little more research. I couldn't really find anything that was of importance, and I would really like this episode to be centered about Katie and the other victims' stories, so there's not really much information on him anyways, nor would I wish to talk about him more. A sense of relief, though, spread over all of Katie's loved ones, from AJ, Caroline, Dave, Jayanne, Tracy, everyone. And for her roommate Tracy, she was so happy because finally her friend would get the justice. But it was awfully painful to think about because she still would never get to see Katie again. Tracy felt a sense of relief because she knew finally that her last moments alive were not ones being betrayed by someone she knew and trusted. It was a total stranger. Detective Myers still had work to do though. They had DNA evidence, and Gabriel Avila was going nowhere. He was behind bars serving a 9-year sentence for another violent crime he had committed. They would get to him. He wasn't going anywhere. Though first, he needed to speak with probably the closest person in Gabriel Avila's life, his ex-wife. You heard that right, his ex-wife, who had divorced Avila right after he was convicted of aggravated burglary against Leslie and Anela. They had DNA evidence, they knew it was a match, but they needed to confirm that those other pieces of evidence they gathered at the scene that I mentioned at the very beginning of this had been left by that small pickup truck, and that Avila had driven one or borrowed one or something. So those tire tracks that were left at the crime scene, well, detectives asked the ex-wife about if they ever owned a truck, if he used a truck. The ex-wife confirmed that they did own a truck, however they did sell it, and gave the information that they needed in order to track down who they sold the car to. The new owners, it had been a couple years, had swapped out the tires for newer ones. But police weren't giving up there. It took them a bit of time, but police were able to locate the original tires on the truck at the time of Katie's death. How? I don't know. Amazing that they could though. And they were an exact match to the tires tracks left behind near the landfill. The ex-wife also gave this really big key piece of information shortly after Katie's death. She didn't know this was in relation to Katie, but she said shortly after, in that September, October area, that when they were planning to sell the truck, she was going through the car to deep clean it to make it look a lot nicer, more presentable to any potential new buyer. And while cleaning it out, she found in a center console a ring. Remember, we talked about Katie's jewelry. She was wearing a watch and 2 rings that night. It wasn't the brand new December birthstone ring that Joe had bought her, but it was the other ring, and there was no denying it was Katie's ring. Finally, Detective Myers knew they had all the evidence they needed. He made his way over to the prison that Gabriel Avila was being held in, and in December of 2006, Detective Myers interrogated Avila, presenting him the ring, the truck, the ex-wife's help, and finding the DNA evidence. There was no way he could deny that he committed the crime, so Avila just slumped over in his chair and admitted he was the killer, giving police the details that only the killer would know. In the middle of the night, on August 31st, early morning, Avila was driving in the neighborhood where Katie lived, buying coke, and he was turning out of the neighborhood, leaving to head back to his home when he noticed Katie walking, alone, with no one around, crossing the streets. He wanted to maybe just hit her, he said, but he decided against it and decided to keep driving. But by some chance, he saw Katie again in the front of her house, watching her to see if she could get into her house, and noticed she didn't have her house keys. So he watched her walk through the side of her house and try to get into her own home through the window, but was struggling to get in. Avila claims he doesn't know what came over him, but as he got out of that car, he hit Katie, forced her onto the ground, and raped her, then strangled her to death using his own bare hands. He then carried her unalive body into his truck, drove her to the outskirts of town, and left her body in the city dump, like Katie was just another piece of garbage, and not some people's world, the nucleus of her family, and the sunshine in her friend's universe. A woman who had so many great achievements in her life and milestones she still had to reach in her lifetime. The woman who was about to get her graduate degree and change the world. He treated her like trash. He then used some alcohol he had on hand and poured it on Katie's back, trying to light her on fire, but it wouldn't work. Whatever he was using wasn't highly flammable. To him, this was just a crime of opportunity. Katie was just found by a monster as she was trying to get home. He was already a violent person who crossed paths with an angel on earth, and that was someone he wanted to harm. Now 27, behind bars, Gabriel Avila was facing new charges of capital murder and rape. The Sepiches were grateful. The killer was caught, but now there was this harsh reality. Katie's law wasn't in effect in 2003 when Leslie and Anella almost became another 2 victims. It couldn't have saved those girls. And remember that psychic I mentioned that told Jayanne and Dave that the killer would be caught by DNA evidence right before Christmas? Well, the psychic was right. 3 days before Christmas in 2006, 3 years later, after he gave his confession, having been caught with infutable DNA evidence, Katie, the winter baby, December 26, 4 days after her killer would be caught, she would have turned 26 years old. The holiday became a really hard time for the family. They were so used to celebrating Katie's birthday and also the holiday. It was this big sort of celebration. And Dave told local news stations the following, and I quote, "We're especially grateful because Christmas had been a sad time for us since Katie died. Jayanne had never forgotten. No one ever gave up. Jayanne knew there would never be true closure, but she was ready to move on, and she said the following. She was never forgotten. No one ever gave up. We've been healing. We've been going forward with our lives. We have 2 other incredible children we love so much, but this will allow us to heal in a way that we couldn't have otherwise." The trial would begin in the spring of 2007. DA Susana Martinez would later go on to become the governor of New Mexico State. But for now, she would be the prosecutor in this case, and she would not drop a single charge, nor offer a plea deal to this man. She knew that she had Avila right where she wanted, and she couldn't lose. There was no way. So he pled guilty right away to a life sentence, to hopefully spend the rest of his life behind bars to eventually die alone, as he should. The Sepiches and Tracy were present at every single part of the court hearings, and at the sentencing, AJ was ready to stand in front of the whole court and to look Avila right in his eye and tell the monster how he stole his best friend, his protector, and finally be able to stare at this scum in the face and address him and confront him. To AJ, this was cathartic. It was something he needed to do. Tracy was also there, and her and the Sepiches begged State District Judge Douglas Driggers to keep Avila behind bars for as long as possible, that they legally could. Now, the public defender, Mark Aaron, asked the judge to be lenient with Avila's sentence because he was remorseful. But where was that leniency or remorse on the morning of August 31st or November? He could have not fled the sentencing in Anella and Leslie's case, but he did, and now he has remorse. DA Martinez argued against the leniency plea by stating that he had 3 years to confess to this, but only did it when detectives had tracked him down with DNA evidence. On May 4th, 2007, Judge Driggers sentenced Gabriel Avila to 69 years in prison with the possibility of parole after serving 30 years. His sentence for the murder conviction would be served after his completion of the 9-year sentence for aggravated burglary against Anella and Leslie. The judge refused to allow him to serve his sentences concurrently. Dave Sepich Sepich told the judge, and I quote, "We did not get another chance to see Katie in this life, and it is only right that the person who did this to her does not get a chance to experience freedom again in this life." Now, something pretty odd happened after the sentencing. Nabila asked if he could speak to the Sepich's family face to face, something that was pretty uncommon, and he wanted to apologize for his actions. To Jayan, it was weird that he was apologizing. Nabila claimed that he didn't know why he harmed Katie, and if he could undo his actions, he would. She says that she saw some sort of remorse in his eyes and that it made it easier to forgive him. She never wants him out of jail, though, never wants him on the streets again, with the possibility of harming anyone else. But for her, she believed that he was sorry and remorseful, and she was supposed to forgive him. She hopes that he finds some sort of salvation behind bars. Now, because of this case, for the past 2 decades, the Sepiches have continued to campaign for the expansion of Katie's Law across all 50 states. And they will not stop until it becomes legalized across all 50 states. The loss of their daughter created an impendance for a new law that requires all suspects to provide DNA samples to authorities who are arrested for certain felonies, namely murder, robbery, and sex crimes, expanding the requirements for DNA sampling. Since the year 1997, in New Mexico specifically, DNA has been provided by felons in hopes to solve other cases, but because of the Sepichs, all people arrested on violent felony charges will now be required to hand over a sample. These samples are now being placed in a cohesive database to compare all the collected DNA samples in association with any and all unsolved crimes. What began as a beacon of hope as an aid to help catch Katie Sepich's killer has become so much bigger than that. There is a multitude of lives that have been saved, crimes that will never be committed. There's no telling how many people Katie's Law has helped. Caroline firsthand saw the fight it took to pass Katie's Law, and she took the importance of DNA to heart. She studies chemical modifications on DNA and RNA to help develop new technology. In 2008, a year after Katie's killer was sentenced, Jayan Sepich created the nonprofit DNA Saves, which aims to educate lawmakers and the public on how DNA tests hold power. Katie's Law was expanded in 2011 to include all felony charges, not just violent felony charges. And the state of New Mexico saw an increase in arrestee matches to currently open cases. The Sepich family worked with then Governor Susana Martinez on expanding Katie's Law to even more states. They learned that the hardest part of getting a law passed is funding. As Dave and Jayan then decided to go to Congress, and after a lot of hard work, they were able to get a law passed that allows states to get funding for the startup costs of arrestee DNA programs. And in 2013, then President Barack Obama signed a federal law named after Katie to help fund expanded DNA testing. Each state has different requirements for their new laws, so Katie's Law is not identical in each state, and it's not called Katie's Law, but we as the public know it as. But based on the curriculum that Jalen created, Katie's Law is expanded. As of today, from the last report I could find, 31 states have adopted Katie's Law or something similar to it. In the description, I have provided the website by the Sepichs. Katie wished to change the world, and in the end, in her memory, her whole family did, for the better. So next time a case is solved by DNA evidence collected from a convicted felon, an arrestee, thank Katie and the Sepichs. That is all the information I have on this case. I know it was a really long one. Let me know your thoughts down below. This case was a roller coaster. There are an unimaginable amount of cases that Katie's Law has prevented from ever happening, and I think that is something wild to think about. It's amazing what this family has done for other victims and for preventing other people from being victimized by felons. Katie seemed like an amazing person, and it's amazing to know that her legacy will live on forever past all of our lives. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like, comment, subscribe. Most of you are not. Please do. If you want to listen to this as an audio only form, the link to the podcast is in the description. My social media is linked down below if you want to follow. And as always, as a palette cleanser, the doggo picture of the week is this picture of Scarlett. It was her birthday recently, so that's her birthday. All right, that's all I have for you. Love you, mean it, kisses, don't think stupid, and I'll see you next time. Bye.